What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. Today we're going to take a look at some models I've never painted before, Cadians. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform to build a beautiful online presence and share what makes you unique in your hobby. Over the years, I have painted a pretty good amount of models. Space monsters, orcs, marines, flying nuns, goblins, dwarves, demons, vampires, and even a frog or two. But in all the years I've painted and played Warhammer, I've never painted a normal human before. If you can call anything in the 41st millennium normal, that is. Astra Militarum, or as far as I remember, Cadians, have just eluded me. I've honestly never held any interest in them, and I didn't really think I ever would. From a kind of outside perspective, they seem a little boring. That was until I got my hands on a few of them and started to take a closer look. Recently, I got a donation to the channel from Jonathan L., and in that donation was a handful of Cadians. Some basic troops, a commissar guy, a tank, and an armored walker. And this got me thinking about a conversation I had recently with Brent from Goobertown Hobbies. What is the perfect amount of models to paint in order to get a feel for an army? The basics of their design and the intention of the sculptor as to how to paint something, or get a specific look. This seemed like the perfect opportunity and amount of models to put that to the test. Will painting a smattering or charcuterie-sized army change my mind about these models, and will I want to go further into the rabbit hole and buy more? Let's find out. Right now I have a squad of Cadian shock troops, an officio prefectus commissar, a heavy weapons team, an armored sentinel, and a Lehman Russ tank. I also happened to cross a really cool model called Colonel Ironhand Strachan, but that model doesn't really fit into this theme that we have going, so I'm going to set him aside. On a personal note, I'm not a huge fan of the jungle fighter aspect of this army. I mean, I like Predator and Rambo and stuff, but I've never really taken to them in model form. Probably because they make almost no sense in this universe. Then again, I guess neither do these other models. What I do appreciate about this line of models, again from an outside perspective, is that they offer a chance to get into historical model painting or vice versa. These models definitely scratch the itch for camo and khaki, and I can understand why they appeal to many players. You can play Warhammer and still use a lot of familiar paints that historical wargamers use. There's also the opportunity to have your very own Carl Weathers action figure, or as close as we can get in 28mm. All that being said, this Colonel Strachan model is kinda rad, yeah, and I'm gonna paint him up at some point, but today is not that day. Most of these models are in pretty good condition. There are some mold lines that will need to be removed, and I'm gonna strip this Sentinel. So let's get the cleanup process going and see where that takes us. So the idea of a micro army really intrigues me. Gathering a handful of models from a particular line to get a feel for how they look and paint up makes a lot of sense for a couple of key reasons. First, it keeps costs down. You only need a few paints to get started, and having a little bit of variety in models keeps it exciting. Buying models you like the look of and not worrying about the full army experience alleviates the need to list build and maximize your strategy for a full game of Warhammer. Another great reason is that an army on a small scale can give you a quick game experience that gives you a sense of how the army is going to play, and whether or not you want to actually invest in growing that list. Lastly, if you want to, you can probably use the small number of models in a skirmish game like Kill Team. So you can still play them on the table and get yourself a few troop options. Unlike buying a start collecting box or a combat patrol, you have the option of picking out more unique units and painting them for the pure sake of painting. Maybe you only want 4 or 5 troops, an HQ unit, and a tank. That will probably end up being less money overall than a proper box. Now, generally speaking, you can find singles or small squads for way less money on the used market, and you still get the experience of painting something new. You just didn't have to buy the full $50 box. Now that the models have been cleaned up, let's figure out what kind of colors we want to go for. I know that I want the scheme to be relatively simple, as there are quite a few models even here that we need to get through this week. But maybe there's something out there to inspire a little bit of flair on top of that can bring this whole thing together. Let's check out some Instagram painters and see what we can find.
Alright, so a search for the hashtag Astra Militarum on Instagram pretty much reveals most of what we're looking for. Right off the bat, this color scheme really does stand out, and it's more of the classical style with the kind of bright greens and the bright khaki, but I do like that extra yellow stripe. I think that's pretty cool. Still, it might be a little too bright for me. These weapon teams are really nicely done. I like how the bases have a lot of different textures on them, and there's a lot of pigment powder usage. I also enjoy how dark these models are, which I'm more partial to anyways. This type of dark green armor and really dirty khaki is definitely something that I'm probably going to go with. Probably not exactly like this, I think it's still a little bit bright, but I like the fact that this is again textured and it has a lot going on. It's really cool. As far as the armored vehicles go, this is definitely what I'm going to shoot for. Again, that dark green, and you've got that nice camo pattern of kind of khaki with that. I think I have an idea for the armor specifically to get kind of a weathered look, a beaten down, chipped paint look, and still kind of do some fun stuff with these like big camo stripes. So I've been looking through this hashtag for a little while, and I think this is actually the closest thing to what I would say is more grim dark than a lot of the other Astra Militarum models that I've seen so far. And I don't know, maybe that's just not really a thing that people do. They don't go too dark with it, or maybe it's one of those things where they have it in mind but doesn't quite get there. I don't even know if I'm gonna get there. But I do like how there's just a lot of grime all over this, and there's extra colors on the armor panel, and there's kind of some rust up here in this, speaker light thing. So I think marrying some of these things together and just seeing what happens is probably the way we're gonna go. I like that idea, and I think I can do that rather quickly.
Before we go any further, let me tell you about today's fantastic sponsor, Squarespace. Sharing what makes you unique in this hobby can be difficult. When you post a picture on a social media platform and someone asks you, how did you achieve that incredible paint job? Well, you can take your time by typing out the step-by-step guide on how to get there. But after a few days of being online, that post will inevitably be buried in hundreds of other posts and be lost to the sands of time forever, never to be seen or referenced again. Using Squarespace's easy-to-use custom templates, you can create that mini tutorial in minutes, and on top of that, share it directly to any social media page. Always available to reference and not lost. This week, I updated my Squarespace hobby blog by adding a quick tutorial on using Silly Putty as a masking tool. It was really simple to set up and share exactly what I wanted in just a few minutes. Everyone in this hobby has a unique perspective, and with Squarespace, you can absolutely share that with others in a very easy and fun way. Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch that hobby blog, go to squarespace.com/miniaturescues to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. Thank you again, Squarespace, for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to those models. Alright, so we have a pretty solid plan for moving forward. I want to get the basic troops knocked out the quickest, so we have a nice order of operations for colors moving forward. Since most of the models that we looked at had a really clean look to them, I want to take these into a more grimdark territory, something darker, chipped up, and weathered. Since these guys feature a whole bunch of khaki, I'm going to speed things up by using my airbrush to base coat the cloth on all of the models. This can be done with a regular paintbrush, of course, and everything after this will pretty much be done that way, but the airbrush is pretty fast. Alright, khaki done. Now we move on to the armor. I'm starting with a nice dark green, getting it on all of the armor. So far this is looking still like a lot of the normal units, and that's fine. There's much to be done in order to get these guys looking more grimdark and beaten up. For all the other details, we're going to need black. A lot of what's left will end up being silver as well, and having a black base coat will give us the best chance for good metallics. So the guns, boots, and insignias all get a coat of black. Most of these models have just a little bit of skin showing, not much, which is kind of nice. So what is there gets a quick coat of Cadian flesh tone. Now normally I would spend more time on painting these faces, but realistically with all the armor covering most of them, I don't think it'll be very important to do a ton of work, especially up front. Little things like what you can see and what you can't see should absolutely affect your process. If you can't really see it, you shouldn't be spending a ton of time painting it. On top of that, since I want these to be dirty and worn models and I tend to use heavy washes to get there, a lot of what we painted now will get covered up. So it's best to wait until the end to do most of the detail work. Most of what I'm talking about really applies to army painting, when you have quite a few models to get through. In this case, because we have a micro army, I can experiment with what I like best and see what it takes in order to paint even more of these models in a somewhat timely manner. So far, I'm likening these to painting orcs, which is kind of weird. The models are set up in a similar way to orcs that I painted in the past, and it actually makes painting them kind of fun. Before we get into washing and cleaning up the models, I want to bring in a lighter green to start the weathering process. Using a piece of sponge, I dab on little spots of green. I want these guys to be beaten up, and this is a good way to start creating some variety in the types of damage on the armor. Now that the base coats are done and the first bit of weathering is complete, I'm going to liberally coat the models with brown enamel wash. This is going to do a couple of things. First, it's going to create separation between each piece of the model by really getting into the recesses. And second, it will tint the lighter khaki towards brown. I let the wash set up for about 15 minutes and came back in with some dry makeup sponges. I can remove a bunch of this wash from the raised details and let some of those original colors show through as free highlights. This actually saves quite a bit of time in coming back to highlighting the model again. Not that I'm going to stop there, but this can be a great way to get your army on the table even faster. Now recently, I got myself a $20 bottle of Dirty Down Rust paint. Yeah, seriously, 20 bucks. This has been a very popular paint as of late, and I figured I'd start to try some out for myself and see what all the fuss is about. Turns out, it's actually pretty freaking good. Using a little bit on the metallic parts of the model takes the clean metal and completely changes the way it looks. Now I like rust, and this is probably the craziest way that I've gotten it in the least amount of time. There's good color variation in the rust, and it actually looks pretty real. I know it's expensive, but wow. Next up, I want to take the weathering a little bit further by adding some chipped edge highlights. I'm going to grab a bright silver and trace all of the armor. But instead of straight lines, I want to break up the length and thickness to create paint chipping. Going over the entire model like this really brings out the armor and makes it look really cool. This is definitely the look that I was after, and I think it will carry through the army really well. Still, there's one last thing to do to maximize contrast and weathering. Using a reddish-orange pigment powder, I'm going to coat the base of the model. And on top of that, I want to bring in little pops of that color under the cloth and armor. This really brings an extra level of color and complexity to the models, while still keeping it rather easy to get to the end. And honestly, I think it looks like really nice weathering. So the basic troops are done. That still leaves one HQ unit and some tanks. Now, I'm liking the direction for colors so far, and I'm hoping that will translate over to the tanks relatively easily, but let's find out. I base coated the tank with the same armor color that the troops have. Then, using that same bright green I used with the sponge, I highlighted the panels on each side of the tank. I used an old business card to mask off the edges so I could get that cool highlight without going over the edge of the plates. This is a great way to highlight panels like this to create separation. The edges where the color stops and hits a hard line of shadow color really gives you good contrast. One of the cooler things on Leman Russ tanks and tanks in this army are those camo stripes. I've seen all sorts of ways to paint them, and it usually involves going back and forth between the two colors to get a clean, rounded line for that camo. Here's the super secret, awesome way to do it though. Okay, maybe it's not really super secret, but this is probably the easiest way to get it done and not have to do a whole bunch of work. Once again, I have stolen my child's silly putty to use as a masking tool. Make sure you have a good thick chunk of it and it's not too stringy as you press it onto the model. The more you press and smooth it out, the easier it is. Once the putty is really on there and you have the shape you want, you can apply paint in a couple of different ways. Personally, I find that an airbrush is the quickest and easiest way to do this, but since the putty is stuck down really well, you can seriously just use a paintbrush to paint in the alternate color. Either way, it will give you a nice rounded, clean edge for your camo, and there really won't be any cleanup to speak of. Now, of course, the best part is removing the putty and seeing how awesome it turned out. Super satisfying. Again, having a small selection of units to paint and not really worrying about getting to the full army is really satisfying. Being able to tackle a 10-man squad and a tank in the same day is awesome, and it actually keeps things interesting. I'm really liking this micro army setup, and I'm actually really excited to see what kinds of small forces I can put together in the future. Being able to buy singles or small amounts of models off of eBay just feels more flexible than being locked into something like a start collecting box. Alright, to weather this tank a bit and get it to match the other parts of the army, I'm going to use that brown enamel again. This time I'll apply it through the airbrush to get an even coat and not make a huge mess. It's alright for the little guys just to use a brush, but I find that larger vehicles or larger models are just easier this way. The same steps are used to remove the enamel, only this time I'm going to bring in a few drops of mineral spirits to cut through and streak that enamel on some of the panels. The armor on the tank is big, so doing a little bit of extra splotches and streaks makes it look properly weathered. Next up, I'll be using that same bright silver to edge all of the armor panels and really bring out that chipping. Especially on the tanks like this, it stands out and gives you enough of an impression that the tank is pretty beaten up, but it still maintains the paint job. And finally, adding some of that powder to the bottom of the tank and the treads brings that color through line to the tank and really helps it belong to the models I've already painted. So painting this mini force wasn't too bad. It was actually pretty fun to paint. I still don't know if I actually like the models on display here, but that brings up kind of my final point. What is being advertised as an army isn't always what it seems. Let me show you what I mean. Here are the Astra Militarum as Games Workshop sells them. Pretty straightforward military dudes. But underneath that, if you dig a little deeper, there's some seriously weird crap waiting. This army has a lot of history, so there are models in there that are still usable today that you just don't see at first glance. These are weird vein psychers. Here's a priest with a chainsword. How about hobbits with sniper rifles? Sure, this is one of those things that I love about how deep Warhammer can be sometimes. There are models that they would never really show publicly or put in a start collecting box, but they belong in this army anyways. And if you want to build a small force that isn't the main showcase set of models, you can totally do that. I went ahead and actually purchased a set of 5 ratlings, those hobbits with guns, and 3 psychers. These old metal sculpts have me more excited to actually do something with this army than the literal 19 different kinds of tanks that you can get. The creativity and craziness on display with models like this are exactly why I would choose to paint an army. Painting these models today really took me on a journey. I did have fun painting them, and I think they look really good together, which makes me happy. But finding out that there are 2 sides to this army really opened up the possibilities and made me want to look deeper. So try something a little different. Don't just accept the average start collecting box as the purest representation of an army. Take a minute to look a little deeper, because you really never know what you're gonna find. Thank you for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video.